Hello, everybody. Bonjour, hello. Before we begin officially, I want to say just a few words in French. Bonjour toutes et tous. La présentation d'aujourd'hui sera en anglais, mais une interprétation simultanée est disponible en bas de vos écrans. Si vous cliquez sur le bouton interprétation, vous aurez accès à l'audio en français. Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's events. My name is Tim Stanley. I'm Professor Emeritus in the Faculty of Education and the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I'll be your host for this evening. I'll shortly be introducing our speaker for tonight, but I wanted to also let you know that you can post your questions or comments in the question and answer section below your screens, and we will share with the speaker some of your questions and so forth after his presentation. I wanted to begin with the Indigenous affirmation of the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. We honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. This afternoon session is part of a larger series called the Bâtir des liens, mobiliser les histoires autochtones pour le changement social, Building Connections, Mobilizing Indigenous Histories for Social Change project. This project is presenting a series of online presentations and workshops exploring two key issues. First, it seeks to identify promising practices to support the efforts of Indigenous communities to collect, preserve, and mobilize their oral and written histories. Secondly, it seeks to advance the efforts of both Indigenous and settler K-12 schools and post-secondary institutions to incorporate these histories into their history education programs without recolonizing Indigenous peoples and their meetings. This series is supported with funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies, and the Faculty of Education and of Arts of the University of Ottawa. It is organized in collaboration with the Faire l'Histoire, Making History Educational Research Unit of the Faculty of Education, and with the Histoire au Canada, Perspective des Premiers Peuples, History in Canada First Peoples Perspective project, which was initiated by the Cégep de l'Outaouais and the Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabeg First Nation Cultural Education Center. This latter project has been developed with the support of the Kiona Institute, the Avatak Cultural Institute, the University of Ottawa's Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Intellectual Traditions and Self-Determination, Production Manitou Inc., the Council of the Atikamekw Nation, and the Museo de Paseo, or the Museum of the People of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The Building Links series began with a presentation by the distinguished scholar of Indigenous research methods, Dr. Sean Wilson, called Building Relationships with Indigenous Knowledge. It will be continuing tonight with a panel featuring 3 Indigenous research chairs who specialize in issues of history and memory and the decolonization of knowledge. These are Dr. Ojig Allen Corbière of York University and Drs. Brenda McDougall and Piero Ross Tremblay of the University of Ottawa. On the 24th at 3 p.m., Karen Workman, the founder and director of the Museo de Paseo, will be presenting on the right to social memory and her work in empowering marginalized communities to take control over the narratives of their past and hence of their presence. Also on the 24th at 7 p.m., Dr. Stuart Barlow, Dean of the Gibney College of Indigenous Australian Peoples at Southern Cross University, Australia, will be presenting Yarning About Yarning, which is about Indigenous traditions of storytelling. On December 8th at 3 p.m., Ms. Workman returns to discuss her work in French through a conversation with Piero Ross Tremblay, while at 7 p.m., Diane Lemay of the Cégep de l'Outaouais, along with her Indigenous collaborators from Quebec, will present an overview of the Histoire au Canada project. We will also have additional presentations starting in January, profiling the history and memory work and teachings of people in Indigenous communities across Canada, as well as presenting the efforts of both public school and post-secondary teachers to develop curriculum in this area. Further details will be available in future on the website of the Faculty of Education, as well as through our partner organizations. With all this in mind, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. I first met Dale Saddleback over 2 years ago when we were first discussing this series. He immediately impressed me with the depth of his knowledge and understanding of appropriate ways to work with elders and traditional knowledge keepers, issues that are central to the Building Connections project. His presentation tonight is particularly appropriate, as last week was Treaty Recognition Week. Something that people in Canada, certainly settlers, need to be reminded is that we already have connections to the Indigenous peoples of this land through a series of treaties. And his presentation tonight is called Treaty and Inherent Rights and Kinship Responsibilities to Guide All the Children in a Natural, Ethical Way. Dale Saddleback is a member of the Samson Cree Nation who experienced early life in the Pigeon Lake Indian Reserve. He is currently a doctoral candidate and part-time professor in the Department of Secondary Education at the University of Alberta, with an interest in Indigenous ways as formalized education. As a Nihaya scholar under the supervision of Professor Dwayne Donald, he aspires to explore the potential of working with elders in places of higher learning. With all this in mind, it is absolutely my delight to turn things over to Dale Saddleback.
Hei Timothy, naskumun. Nasi mina tawa imi gawia. Naskutia. Magani gan ganehia wan. Ego wetin na yo kan to tawie. Gana to ke timi muta. Absolut oasis. Is not good. Stay skaten man. Jag går man en giftig. Jag vill inte mag. Jag är inte ogiftig. Mån speak to games and you take nine. Mam school together and square. Jag gitta. Jag tycker det. Jag är inte jag sen att stämma. Jag nog det. Jag går man inte gitta då jag that yes, you know, stay on going. The way gospel time. I saw them not to real or keep that the real. Mix it, which in now seeing the going to be a what I will may else a thousand. The heavy and ask one until it snaps in your hands. Mix it, the mat now, they walk into the movie. So it's it to get oh, to get it to go so. Ego, the papa. Now it's it on ya. It means a taxi, to go so. Mix it. Machitana. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity. My name is Dale Saddleback from the Pigeon Lake Indian Reserve. My membership is in the Four Nations of Musqueam, and I hold membership with Samson, which is the larger of the four. And they were formerly called Kobima, so you might have heard that name. I'm going to be sort of interpreting a little bit of some of the things I know can't be translated by our interpreters. So I just wanted to give thanks to the Creator for this opportunity to share that we this knowledge that some of the elders have shared with me, because like I said in pre, I don't know anything. And I always ask for the forgiveness of our elders and our knowledge holders, because I don't think that highly of myself to be speaking in public and addressing some of these issues as an elder would. So with that, I'm always very grateful and humbled by these opportunities to share what little I know. As a scholar, I know it's a matter of being on two paths and looking at the world from that perspective of being that space in between. And so my presentation is all about the future of our children, because those are what the elders have raised concern about in the past. And for me, they've instilled those values in me. As I now, I share that concern, and I'm trying to address as much as I could as a scholar. So, without further ado, I want to acknowledge tomorrow is Remembrance Day, as you know, on a calendar day, but there's just a lot of people from our past, from our histories, that were forgotten in those older, different kind of skirmishes and events that might otherwise be called acts of war or massacres, or some of the language that comes out in the history. But nonetheless, the elders would use the word "himaksona," which is in English the description of a carcass that has been just left without any last rites. And unfortunately, we sort of washed over a history where that had happened. Not only here, but it was learned, I believe, modeled well in the south of the 49th parallel. And so I would like to take this opportunity, take a few minutes to acknowledge those who had paid the ultimate price, as they say. And they say that they fought those battles for us, and they acted like men. And a lot of times we don't get an opportunity in these presentations to use our mantras in a traditional way, and by that word, it connotes a song that sometimes these war mothers in the States acknowledge that their sons did not come home. And for many of us that went to residential schools, of all places, didn't expect to not come home, but that also happened. And so I also had two great grandfathers that served in World War I, and they didn't get their soldier settlement lands, and they returned, and to date. And so these songs are for them and for these forgotten fallen warriors. And for the victory song, for the warriors. Well, thank you for bearing with me. The image you see in front of you is obviously a picture of my family. That's me, the chubby one in the middle. But without humor, our culture doesn't really work too well. So some of these elders that talk about how we're supposed to acknowledge what we've been gifted often has to do with this story that we heard. And these words that you see in syllabics in front of you, Nstami Maganak and Peakohawe. I'll cover it a little bit later in another slide, but it's basically this idea that all of the people on this land, this place we call Turtle Island, are all one family, living in one people. Anyways, this image is about the Union Jack that we still use in Treaty 6 area here for recognizing that it was a nation-to-nation deal, and that it was based on perpetuity on things that were emerging out of the ceremony itself, which was the sun, the grass, and the water. But the water sometimes gets a little bit overshadowed by actual rivers and lakes and streams. And some of the elders refer to the fact that it's talking about birth, and that we come through gestation and water, and that's how a lot of these things are acknowledged in treaty. So there's a lot more depth and a lot more meaning to do with this what I call a sacred feminine knowledge. And that comes from this idea that we were very protectionist of that concept. And also our archive, which was this idea that our elders held knowledge that normally in other cultures we would see stored in the library. But the definition of a conquered nation is one that has no archive. And so a lot of those nations that were conquered in ancient times and did not have this ability to recover was due to the fact that their archives were burnt to the ground. And so for us as Indigenous people, we're very fortunate that our archives were maintained by the minds and the hearts of men and women, obviously. But this first family is this idea that it's tied to the creation story, and that this word Anskotapewin runs through the hearts of these people. And when we use the denotation of that Anskotapewin, we're saying that the transference of that heart fire, that sacred heart fire, it comes out in the language of a wagon train. Because a tapan is something that you would pull, a wagon. But anisk is this prefix that connotes the passing down. And that's good, because there's a fire. So it's this idea that all of these grass that you see swaying are the people. And this, the beauty of this culture that we have called Pawa, which, obviously have evolved since times of contact to what it is today. Like some of the ancient prescriptions are more ceremonial and more, because a lot of our ceremonies are about giving life. And so that's why they were done, is because people believed that when they went there, they were getting an extension of their life. And maybe not just for showing up, but for other kinds of contributions and different ways of sponsoring the main sponsor. But showing up is a lot of giving thanks is associated with that. And we call that in Cree, we call that PTO. That means those people physically showed up at the ceremony. And a lot of times these young people, they misinterpret, like say when you're gonna go get a name and they bring protocol and they want a name for their child, but they forgot the child, They actually have to bring that child to the elder, because there's different ways that these things can occur. But mainly that's the one for our elders, they say is PTO. It's good for that child to be there. And these are some of the concepts I think that really need clarification, like this idea of a teepee and a woman in that sacred art context. The teepee is modeled after a woman who has her hands upright in prayer. Prayer is not really the word, but it's the closest English word we could come for to Gadi Simuin. And that's what we interpret today as prayer. And we say that word kind of too often maybe to our kids, but we should be using Gadi Simuin so that they'll understand it in a more meaningful way, because it's sort of like finishing. And a lot of those concepts are in a parallel with the Christian doctrine, is like on heaven as it is, on earth as it is in heaven. So this is what some of that language, when you look at it, that's what is revealed, because they say that it's an enigma is built into the language. And when you unravel it, it reveals truths. And and that's the word that Luke Groves University actually uses for their curriculum, because their elders, the local elders that helped them develop their curriculum, told them that that was the word that they would use to describe what the Cree language does to us as Cree speakers and Cree people. And that means that it tells us, it's a dictate of how to live your life in a good way, a meaningful way. Because it's all about this relationship. And treaty for those of us who are having these more modern interpretations, because now we have more information to work with. And I, for example, was fortunate to recapture my language. And so I use that as sort of a tool for interpreting some of this newer data that's coming in. And so I have an extra tool on my belt to be able to help come up with some of the answers that we need, because I wouldn't go near the idea to say that I have all the answers or I have anything that's meaningful, because my presentation is for you to decide if some of these things resonate with you, and how maybe towards the conclusion, as I make some suggestions and provide a few options of what we can do differently, because we've obviously been doing a lot of the same things and they haven't been working. But I'll cover that in the end. I have a slide specifically for that topic. I just wanted to emphasize that there was a time before contact that a lot of these things were going on, and I call this sort of the original programming. And I have a colleague, and they were doing research in the language for a long time, and they hired me recently to try and model it, because they couldn't work with they were an older generation, and the newer technology was a little bit of a jump for them, and they couldn't work this model out in Word, and they couldn't do it with, so they wanted me to digitize their idea. And so this is what I ended up with. And it's sort of this conceptual idea of what we call Nisto Tamawan, which is understanding. And it's a threefold concept. That's why it's a triangle. But they weren't sure exactly the proportions. And they wanted me to put the circle inside the triangle because of the teepee and the fire that's at the center of that. And so a lot of these words that you see in this design, you see them in syllabics because they're protectionists, and they don't even want to put it in SRO so that people would sort of be this challenge to get in there and transliterate the syllabics into SRO yourself and then look up the meaning. And it's sort of like a research adventure, but it's really mind, body, and spirit at each point. And those are the four directions, because we're called Nehiawak for a reason. And where that H came from, some of the elders aren't sure, but a lot of the older generations are switching back to Nehiawak, which really is four directions people. And so we have these sort of like the Christian ways, or we call them cardinal directions. We just call them the main directions, where the sun is the east, and Ogima Vieso, the thunderbird, is in the south. The old man wind, St. Ilio, in the west, and St. Eumos was the Togtok, or the old buffaloes in the north. And those are the main directions you'll see in the Sundance. But this is the same concept that's being covered here, because what's missing from a lot of our descriptions of what happens when a child is growing up is that developmental model. And so a lot of us were sort of force-fed Piaget's model when we went to teacher college and stuff like that. And we weren't presented with any options, and there was only like all of this philosophical and psychological and all of these ologies that we had to know so much about. And epistemology is one of the ones that I sort of contend with a lot, because I don't think that it matches any description that we have in our language. And I'll get into that a little bit later too, because I just want to get some of this pre-contact stuff out of the way, because what was going on inside that teepee, a lot of it had to do with this feminine activity of starting the early years of a child and owning that child, recognizing and respecting that child's space and not allowing any exposure to too many negative things. And so these lullabies and this swing that was hung low to the ground, because some of the people still use these swings, but they make them kind of high so they can stand beside them. It's actually kind of dangerous, and they already knew that. So this is a good description from Alan Sapp's art collection, where they are low to the ground, and there is, very minimal chance of the baby falling out and getting hurt or anything like that. It's sort of like how the Jolly Jumper was discovered. They say that was an indigenous person put their baby in a cradle and hung it on a branch, and that baby's legs could reach, and it started jumping. It's very safe, these things called moss bags. So a lot of the sacred feminine knowledge had to do with us as men, as little baby boys being cared for by special people called mothers, the Dawina. And the level of attention to the sanctity of our physical makeup and our spiritual makeup was always acknowledged in that process. And so that different things were happening as we were growing. And these were the masters of understanding what was happening during that process. And definitely knowing what to instill in us while we're in certain stages of life. And so, Te pahamatuan, ni gosuan, and nio kiskino tahawasuan, as I put in the description of this, about a delicate balance. And there's a word for it in our language, but I think I'm already giving away a lot for the amount of information that's out there in relation to the sanctity of how else we are supposed to really get this information. And so maybe that's why our PowerPoint kind of did a little trick on us. That's why I always smudge, and I always use this tobacco and sweetgrass, because that's what the elders say, that these things are not secular concepts. And so I'll cover that a little bit later. But here I want you to know that though this child is in a modern outfit, and it's a sort of modern material to make this outfit, he's already being shown ways to figure out and conceptualize this idea of balance. The idea behind a grass dancer, as I was taught, is associated with balanced footwork and a balanced motion that draws on the viewer. Because if you're compelled so much to what you're seeing, it could actually bring healing to you. And so these are some of the ideas behind me doing. And that's what he's doing in this. He's presenting his maneuvers as an offering. And if you're a recipient and you're open to that idea, that can come to you as a blessing and a feeling that you would get. And how it would probably come is you would be wanting to dance with him, like him. That's how good it would make you feel to watch this person doing their special maneuvers to that special beat, to that special tonal structure, that mantra of the ancient ones. And that's what is here, because there's it's always twofold on that path. It can be negative or positive. And the old people had always picked the straight road because it was modeled after Oskutia, the pipe stem. And it became a really important symbol in the peace negotiations during the treaty. And so the pipe is very symbolic and important and salient to me as one of those in the treaty negotiations process, and what it should still mean to a lot of people today, because it's the standard for truth. And that's what we said to the visitors. We said, well, we want to smoke this, we want to make this deal on this pipe, and that means that nobody can lie. Right? And so that's one of the important features of the stones and this thing called pipe. But here, this is where I wanted to emphasize this role of this woman, because over here we're talking about her domain. And I don't want people to confuse this with the domesticated housewife interpretation, because it's far from it. As a matter of fact, there's a sacred fire on the inside of the teepee that the elders say is particular to the female, that men don't really have any jurisdiction. I'll use that fancy word, but it means that the authority within that circle belongs to the woman, and its structure and its the word here is umigo stamate, and that means that's basically what it means, is the queen of that domain. And again, over here on the far left, we have the Wahawe. But these are actual posters that were commissioned by Enoch Cree Nation to be made for their youth, because they claim that they have a 95% language loss, and this is one of the ways they wanted to address it. So it's sort of this like an all points bulletin, but more like an all angles approach, because there was so many different ways that our culture is being threatened in our languages. And so it's sort of this all angles of all of those different ways that are being used, like technology, social media, all these different things, videos, books, magazines, you name it. These are the things that I feel we should be using to battle that force that's trying to reduce it, right? Because it is a form of reductionism. And these syllabics are through a study that I read about, and I didn't really have time to cite it, but it was a scholar by the name of Graham Pike who studied power symbols in the Orient, and compared Chinese power symbols and Japanese power symbols in use, and they were very effective. And so this is where I got this idea to not necessarily always fall into that notion that we're going to be universalized more by the English language, and that it's a matter of mutual respect. In the treaty process, I think the invitation was open for anyone who wanted to learn our language to learn our language. And this is what Father Lacombe took that invitation, and also became one of the priest scholars of the area back in the day. And when I was working at Blue Quills College, I happened to be an inheritor of those files. And when I was working in Samson, I managed to get my hands on John Eliot's syllabics from 1666. But it sort of confirms that James Evans might be in his claim might be in question, where he wanted to patent the syllabics, because his syllabic patent, I think, dates to the mid-19th century, and John Eliot's syllabic hymnals and stuff were existing well in the 17th century in Boston. And so when we think about the syllabic caves, we as Indigenous people know that it was the creator that gave us these symbols. And this is his language, just like all languages, but he made them in an order. And our elders are under the impression that this one was one of the first that he created. And over here on the bottom, those are the ones that these women have for Kutawan, and then that concept of the pipe and the treaties and everybody living in one teepee as one big happy family. And these images, these are actual images of etched on stone somewhere of a family. And that's what that word there, Wahawe, starts off as a singular, ends up as a plural. One of the rare words we have like that. And these buffaloes, we're a buffalo nation. So when they decimated our buffalo population, they nearly decimated us. And that was given the upper hand to what James Bishop calls clearing the plains. But I also have a slide on that. And so a part of this original programming that I'm referring to was just about to be interrupted by these huge events of these, what some of the early historians say were being told in the oral history as Wemstigol Sea, which is a really big boat. because sea is a boat. Mystic is wood, and Wem sort of connotes this preparation of that wood in a way that makes the boat and its shape. But these floating islands is what they were calling them. And to them, it was sort of this divine intervention. That's sort of how they interpret it. And so that note in my description about discernment, to me, means that they should have recognized that a lot of these things that they were witnessing were really amazing, I could imagine, but were discernibly human. So there was something that happened, and this is where a lot of the gray area comes in terms of how can we really figure out what happened when a lot of that stuff was not written, and the oral tradition may have fell by the wayside because of a lot of the death and carnage that was occurring. So there's a lot of oral history that it's lost in time. Anyways, I wanted to use this slide to remind how it all began. This relationship that we have. It started with a journey across this great divide, divided by water. And me as a scholar, I don't really find too much reference to anyone who is honoring those people who did perish on that journey too, and how they might be related. I myself, I went to the National Archives and I found a Deschamps name all the way back to France. And I know that my Métis roots go back to France. And some of the Deschamps that took that perilous journey were ended up in Quebec, which brings me to that word, because I know I heard it a couple of times by a couple of elders who were saying, Kapag. The people on the land saw these boats and they were saying, Kapag. That means land your boats, land your boats. And today, they say that land is called Quebec. And so, again, there's a lot of our language that's still here, like even Canada itself. I know there's other tribal claims of what they say it means, but we sort of have these universal features like that, because for us, it's Kanata, and that means a clean place. And Kanata is still used by some of the elders to describe Turtle Island and Oma Mensti. But those are some of the exclusions historically that we never got a chance to say, well, hey, this is what we call it. And then as a part of that colonial process, they got to decide what we were called, and we became called the Cree people. But I actually have a preference, and I want to be called Nehio. And that's because self-referencing and self-identifying is a privilege of the person being called something, right? And Indigenous is also one of those titles that people chose for me. But it's not, it's actually a fact, but it doesn't mean that anyone else is not Indigenous either. So this whole concept of indigenization is sort of lost on me a little bit, because you could be indigenizing anything as long as it's you, right? And you're Indigenous to something. So it's kind of a little bit two-way meaning. And this is the things that Derrida warned us about. Every word has a connotation and it leads somewhere else. And so our language are very descriptive and very accurate in their description, so that we know what we're talking about when somebody says, Wemstigosi. And the idea that we use this word to describe those flags we use in a ceremony as Wemstigosiwako, which is the blankets that these people carry and sort of even modeled by these sails. But that's what we now use, because we have a treaty with, and we consider it sacred. And this is how long we've been living up to those terms, because we still use those flags in our ceremony. I used to wonder where they come from, but now I know. And this is what happens when you get older and you start investigating and you take protocol to different elders. And it's sort of like a little bit unfair, right? Because I had to spend money out of my pocket. And I know I can't even tell you how much I spent getting this knowledge. and how much time it took. Not only listening, but learning the words and sitting the time with the elder and spending the money to get the protocol and then gifting him after, and that lady or whoever. And how many times I can't count. And this is why, you know, I choose not to write about some of these things, because I'm a tuition payer. I'll be paying twice. I paid for this knowledge through the culture and the protocols and all that time, and now I'm paying tuition, and somehow it's calculated or somehow schemed that I ought to share what I know. But that's not how I was taught, because that very first slide about family means that if I make a mistake or if I overlook some ethical value or principle, it's going to be my children that'll pay the price. And that's why this tobacco is important, because that's who's standing in front if there's no tobacco there. And that's why it's very hard to get anything moving, because I don't want to put them in front of that. There's an ethical space that needs to be maintained in the highest standard. And that's why when things go awry, people wonder why. But it's actually related to, as good as your protocol is, that's how good your ceremony will turn out. So if you pay attention, double attention to the details and all of these finite little things that seem idiosyncratic, your ceremony will actually turn out really, really good. And so this is what happens when people do a Sundance. There's so many steps. There's so many things they have to take care of. But in the end, it pays off, because it looks like it's real easy in the end. But really, it was all of these months of preparation and all of these people contributing and making effort to make sure that that thing runs smoothly on the days of, because it takes like 4 days to go through all those activities. And so this idea of something interrupting us is really one of the metaphors I like to share with people, because it's sort of like this idea that we now interrupt your regularly scheduled program for this really important message. And ironically, or we did not go back to the original programming. And we're still in this big interruption stage. Even though it may only be a test, we're still in this, hung up on this, this thing that had been interrupting us from, and Sylvia McAdam calls it nationhood interrupted in her book. And it's basically this idea that we had been living in a certain way. And when the treaties came, because arguably one of the most important clauses is the medicine chest clause. But saliently for me, it's about the one that says living unmolested and to live as we were. And so we can go back to that original program. And the archive is there to do so. The protocol becomes one of those barriers. Doesn't have to be though, it just needs to be better understood, I believe. Because there was a time when killing Indians was you know, pretty good thing, you know, and it's hidden and it's pushed away, and it's in this American history. I just happened to spend a couple of emails with this university professor from the University of Minnesota, and for the life of me, I just contacted him out of this magazine I've seen. I think it was Cowboys and Indians or something, and there was this title headliner from the old newspapers, and it said, "More good Indians made." And it was a report of the cavalry going to go kill a innocent tribe, babies, women, children, and that was in the actual report. And these words are still out there when you do some of the research on the American side, that people like David Crockett and said like things like, we shot them like dogs, you know, and things like that. And the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Some of these attitudes carried across the 49th parallel in those time frames. And this is what I meant in my description about those atrocities, because I'm citing Deuteronomy for a reason. Maybe somebody could say, well, you know, this is rules of engagement to do with more than the 20th century. I don't know, because Deuteronomy suggests that rules of engagement are ancient, dating back to all of those Palestinian earliest skirmishes and stuff. And so when you're approaching people you want to conquer, you're supposed to make an offer of peace. And I think this is what all these treaties were. But history will tell you that that's not what happened. And America was actually built on a lot of these acts, you know? And so that's what that first slide was actually a mass grave that we see duplicated in Germany sometime later, but was actually here first. And sadly, it was our brethren Sioux that were mainly the victims of that event. But they had been hunted down by, you know, the cavalry for a long time. And our historians weren't really shedding light on that prior to James Bishop. And so there's all these Ray, Dickinson, and all of these references, because Samson had sued the federal government, and we spent hundreds of millions of our dollars fighting that case. And a lot of those cases ended up hiring all of these anthropologists and scholars to come and testify in our case. And we ended up with 2 floors of records of all of these historical champions of history and writing our history. And nobody said anything quite as poignant as James Bishop, when he let the truth out that the government had it in for us. And he called it a policy of starvation, and sort of even an infectious myth, which meant that this emaciated man actually lived in such a state of destitution that, you know, signing his X on a piece of paper for a chunk of land so he can get something in his stomach is actually not an ethical way to deal with people in terms of negotiating. So easily, you know, they could just say, where do I sign? I need something to sustain my life, or I'm going to die, and there'd be no use for me to sign that. And so a lot of things were really, it was a really raw time. I remember he came to Enoch and he presented, and he had such a response. You know, there was a raw response from these. I'll just say people who didn't know, and they were literally in tears when they would come back the next day. He gave out copies. They would come back the next day and they had questions. And a lot of those people were in tears because they didn't know. The average citizen did not know what the government was doing. And so he's sort of this noteworthy person in time where the paradigm began to shift. And so when we see where we are today, I attribute a lot of those shifts to people like this who were willing to say, you know, the truth, and come to terms with that. Because it's okay, it means good things. Because these Gradual Civilization Act and the Indian Act, they're still affecting us, and they're still drawing on us to assimilate. Because for me, for example, in the terminal degree program, and I'm feeling like there's nothing there to catch me, because on my reserve, for example, I don't see any kind of programming that's designed to catch me. And so I might end up having to transition back off the reserve so that I can use my education at the level that I was intended for. Otherwise, these positions, they're not being thought of as something that ought to be created in our economy, and that there should be something to catch us after we finish our terminal degrees. Otherwise, it just discourages anyone from even getting a master's. And I think that's why it's so meaningful for me to be able to be where I am. And I'm always grateful, because these children, they were treated like vocational, you know, almost like objects. And there were never given any expectation, the benefit of any doubt that they would get anywhere past grade 9. and they were treated more or less like cheap labor and, you know, borderline slaves. And they did a lot of hard work and they learned a lot of good things doing that work, but were never recognized or were never given an opportunity to advance their aptitudes and abilities. And so we were left in the dark, those of us that couldn't speak. This was the description that the elders used for someone who loses their language. Ewan Pipsko Gate. It means that you could be a really highly educated person, and if you don't speak your language, it's really hard to communicate what these elders are really meaning in their words. And I understand this to have sort of a meaning that's associated with their abilities, because when we live in a secular world, the skills that we develop tend to be based in that culture. And so what we were doing before is we were honing skills that were not yet secularized or were not yet demonized, because a lot of the things were demonized. And we were like Devil's Lake. Apparently, it's in the oral tradition that actually used to be called Manitou Lake. And Devil's Mountain used to be called Manitou Mountain, but when these early anthropologists found out what they're really called, they changed it to opposite to demonize it. And so Devil's Lake, Manto Lake became Devil's Lake, and Manitou Mountain became, you know, Devil's Mountain, things like that all over the land. So it was, again, it was this all points bulletin, this all angles approach to just literally rape the minds of our people and not let them have anything, a shred of their historical. And this is also proven in a video that I found from Glenn Beck. I didn't have time to share that either, but he interviews a historian named Loback, and they talk on a bit about what Benjamin Franklin and you know, the earliest American establisher and people who were there right from the get-go. And there they say that the Smithsonian Institute was set out from the get-go to refuse positive Indigenous histories. And so if that is the case, and if he's right, then it wouldn't have mattered, because all of the histories they would accept have to do with either genocide or, you know, calling us heathens and, you know, all the negative things that we hear that eventually evolved into all of these negative stereotypes. And so I sort of, these are some of my concluding slides, because it sort of draws on the idea that when I first came into the program I'm in, methodological choice was a very tenuous and, you know, difficult path to try and difficult concepts to try and fit in with the way that I think our culture works. And over time, I tended to think that we're naturalizing these methodologies. And I think it's sort of a methodological naturalization means that it's this notion that we can solve our problems by some or through some methodology. And my example is our epistemologies as a concept in Western incongruent or are equal to neo-Okinawasan or neo-Kiskinutahawasan in our language. No one's answered these questions. So I left it as a big question mark, because even for me, I can't see that on the right-hand side where you see the Cree version of what I think they might mean when they say it's sort of an epistemological relation. It wasn't humanized. It wasn't from an anthropocentric perspective that we were saying these things. Because our belief is that a child is awi means lone, and that that ending cis is the ending for sigosis. So these children that we have are loans from the sky beings. They're not our children. And so it's not from this anthropocentric perspective that we see matching what epistemology might be described as a philosophical base coming from the West. And so the idea is that these and doing it in a good way haven't been secularized, because we still look at it as a concept where our children are not ours, and neither is this life. He's the one that has all of the final say in what we do, how everything is going to turn out. And so sort of brings me to my last slide, because like I said, this time limitations and all of these things will restrict us from being able to share too much. But my all angles response or approach in response is definitely not limited to what I'm about to present to you, because it's just what I see out there and some of the things that I've helped with. And so these treaty history curricularization projects that are coming out of the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, those histories have not been curricularized in formal settings. And so our children need to know, because if we have 600 and some odd nations across Canada, you have 600 and some odd histories that need curricularization. And who's going to make a compendium of all of them? So I think what needs to happen is, because this work can be done in a very efficient and timely manner if it's assigned to all of those people who know that they have to do this work, for one thing, but who has the resources and the capacity to fill in those blanks, as many as we can, so that children actually have a source for identity. And I worked for the Manitoulin Island. There was concern from their elders about oral tradition. And so oral tradition is this really difficult beast to work with, because it's not really the same as written tradition. So that's why these elders are so reluctant to come and tell you, oh yeah, you can write down anything I say. So, they actually don't want that, because it becomes dogma when it becomes written. And then that's how it impacts us. And a famous scholar named Plato, who quoted Socrates, actually warned us that you are actually writing to forget. And this was from the earliest, and you just have to look up Socrates' take on oral tradition, and you'll see that, on written traditions, and you'll see his argument. But some of these oral tradition outcomes, as I call them, and we can quote them as OTOs if you want. Some of them happen in sacred contexts. And so this is where your sweat lodge comes in, and maybe you take your students out to the sweat lodge and then they participate in the ceremony, but they don't necessarily have to write all that stuff down as a teacher and say lesson plan, and because the elder is concerned about that information being written, right? So my suggestion to them was to just write it as an OTO and code it as that, and then the elder is responsible for making a synopsis and the assessment of what the lesson was and what the outcome was. And so it brings me to the language courses. Today, a lot of the language courses, we researched them, I know, are not producing as many speakers as we ought to. And so they should be a little bit more research-based is what I'm thinking. And they should aim more at oral literacy in that process. And I mean, not only oral in the pronunciation stuff, there's also an oral component to do with your ears, and oral attentiveness, and learning how to listen as a skill, because that was a skill that they shared, these elders had shared with us, and said that, you could listen with your hands. And if you ever close your eyes and try to make your way up a stairs, you can use your hands. So you can see with your hands, so you probably can also listen with your feet if you choose to. And it's just the way that the elders were talking, that you could listen with your whole body. And so we need them. to be around. And that's the next point, is that elders in residences, a lot of people already recognize that, because they don't want to put it in the book. So you're not going to have this book in a library, and you definitely don't want to keep an elder there. So, you know, a lot of them are getting accommodated for in terms of a nice little office space and just a place to hang out, and then respond when being called, and then come to the aid of these people who need that ethical balance that's so difficult and sometimes hard to find, elusive. And some of the other things that are helping a lot of people that are going on, you know, year in and year out, and a lot of people getting a lot of positive feedback from cultural camp. Like these people that have skills with hunting and fishing and trapping, and these gathering of medicines and picking berries, and all of the beautiful things that were going on, you know, prior to contact, because this is a part of that living unmolested, living in the way that we were found concept, being sort of conservation versus preservation. Let us back on our traditional lands. Let us even perhaps replant some medicines on some lands that were usurped in that process, like where they grow traditionally. And sometimes those are the best areas for that thing to grow. And another good thing that I recognized in his teaching inside Wake was these traditional powwows where there was no competition, because that's how they were before. We didn't compete for money. There was no money. And so when we got together as a social powwow, as a social event, it made more sense to the kids. It meant more to them. And they participated more willingly. And a lot of these kids I'm talking about were like the untouchables, the ones that were right on the edge of gang life, ready to be jumped in. And they would come to the big drum, and the big drum would calm them down and invite them. And then they would say, well, eventually, some of them did say, I don't need that gang. And they hung with us, and we went around singing at these local school powwows. Because if you have a little circuit of them, then you can have more of them, and you can visit each other, and you could learn these customary laws to do with visiting. Because that's another thing that the treaty coin connotes, is when you shake hands, you're actually in traditional sports and games. And again, you know, running, throwing an arrow through a hoop, now it's rolling, things like that. They're all researchable. There's ways that you can bring them back. There's other games, you know, that I'm researching here that were physical and they were challenging, and they're sports, lacrosse, you know, some of those tribes in the East have that. There's different activities that we use to stay physically, you know, capable and being ready for pretty much anything. And that's what, you know, I think is going to sort of help our kids round out in the future. But with that, I think I wanted to just sort of finish off there. And if anybody had any questions, it would be a good time to save you a little bit of time and give me some time to think about your questions and response.
Oh, okay, Dale, maybe if you can unshare your screen. I think that's something that you need to do. If people have questions or comments, please put them in the question and answer section. There's a couple of things that came up as you were talking, so let me just ask these questions and see if any more come up. So the first one is from Jordan Robinson, who early on was saying, "Hi Dale, would you say most of the Nehaya teachings are quite gentle and practical?"
Would I say that?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say that it's just like any other culture, it varies. And like, for example, when a lot of these, at the end of 1985, we had no more Rattlers treaty. So a lot of the warriors' ways were not being practiced anymore, and they were out of practice, and they still are out of practice. And there was a man named Late Pete Waskaha, who was on a video, and he talked about the last warrior was in the Cree way was Tapapa Matake. And those were the last times that some of our pre-warriors ways were in practice. And so I wouldn't really say that a lot of them were kind and gentle, because we had a two-chief system, and when the tribe was at peace, the peace chief had all the authority, and then when war was declared, a pipe moved and the war chief took over, and the peace chief no longer had any say what the tribe did. And so that's what happened in Frog Lake. And that was the last time that our warriors and our bachelor's TP was used, as far as I know.
Okay. Thank you. Stephanie Roy has a bit of a comment, but let me make it a question. And that's that oral traditions, traditional outcomes in sacred contexts is to protect our knowledge. And she says it's a good approach that needs to be more used even in academia. Do you have some thoughts about bringing it into, I mean, in some ways your whole talk has been about this, but about bringing it oral traditional outcomes in sacred contexts more into, frankly, academic settings?
Yes, because it's really hard for elders to share, because they have to have trust in the system. And if they think, like, for example, my uncle was always being asked for traditional knowledge by non-traditional people, and he would just outright ask, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Because the level that you're asking is enough to put that ceremony up. So are you going to be sponsoring ceremony in the future? Is that why the depth of your question is so deep? You know, otherwise you can just ask a really generic question. And this was the same question that some of these early anthropologists also had, and they were kind of told to keep their questions general, unless they were willing to sponsor a ceremony. So a lot of times, yes, that sacred knowledge and all of these things, we're trying to work hard to protect them, but at the same time, there is a way to expose, because how will that understanding come? And it'll be modeled by people who are just, I guess, willing to make accommodations, because a lot of times people aren't willing. They're not willing to relinquish that authority that they had intergenerationally usurped as settlers. It's difficult to understand, you know, for us, because a lot of times we find it so easy, like when someone is sick and dying or something, and we feel compelled to give something, or, you know, a lot of times we even sacrifice ourselves for our family members, and we go do a fast for a sick family member. But yeah, that's I think it's merited, and it's now time to start shifting some of these teachings into campuses, but always in a safe way. Always trying to remind ourselves that we don't want to put our kids in front of that bus. You know, that's what's really is the question. And so when we write things down, that's what we're doing. But at the same time, if we give all of the sacred stuff, that's what we're doing too. So we gotta always try to find that balance, and just say, well, can you do with this much of this traditional knowledge? Is that enough to help you understand? Because I don't think you need the whole thing, or else maybe you need the experience. And I know that in Saddleback Sundance recently over here, I noticed that there was some white folks in there behind the fence. That means they were dancing. That means they were fasting. That means they were daring to share that experience on a different level than just to be an observer. Because that's another thing that elders warn us about, is just being an observer. So hi, thank you for that question.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing effort at balance.
Yes, it's delicate and it's elusive at times, but it is attainable.
Okay. We have 3 comments / questions, which all focus on, people want to hear more about oral attentiveness. This comes from Julie Lapointe. Raquel Farrow says she's too busy listening with her feet to write a question. And Jay Peterson wants to know more about the Nihia understanding of what it means to listen. I think it's somehow especially appropriate for this kind of Zoom format because what we are having to do is to listen. I think we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, okay. Well, they say that the human is made up of, like a threefold concept times two. In other words, there's a six-pointed star out there that's sort of related to this concept of perfect geometry. And if you divide a circle by 6, you actually get 6 equal sixes. And those 60-degree angles could make up the point of a star that would be equal in all of its dimensions, and it would be geometrically perfect. And this is where they say that we come from, this place of geometric perfection. But that upper one, when we're born, comes separated because we're born like that. But shortly after birth, because birth is set to be our first ceremony, we become separated from that. And so, and as our parents are raising us in that sanctity in that sacred space, and I'm not sure if that happens anymore, but there's a certain way that you bring up a baby and a child, and in gestation too, you're always talking and smudging the belly and stuff like that to bring this child into a sensational orientation into the world. And at that time, those things become separated again. So the East Indians, for example, believe that when you're born, you know everything, but something happens and it's like you're separated from that knowledge. And then your life is about reattaining it. And so these activities you do as you're growing is trying to reattain and reconnect with that thing that you lost at birth. And so when we listen, it's a part of that physiological makeup that the Creator made with perfection. Otherwise, your nose could be over here and your ear could be right here, right? So we're made with this physical perfection that is modeled after Him, and it's modeled after the earth. That's why we have so much water in our body and so much minerals and so many of these different things. But what they say is that you can heighten your ability to use these things by hearing, right? But you can also heighten the ability to use them by giving back. And what they would say is that when the Creator gave you life, there was nothing on earth that you could give back to Him that He would want. So you can't go gather a pile of gold. You can't, gather all your best things and say, "Here, Creator, give me this ultimate listening ability." No, the only thing that you have that you can offer Him back that He's willing to take is this thing you have called time and energy. So if you fast and if you dedicate some time to Him, He will give you something in return, namely what you're asking for. But that's when they say, be careful what you ask for, because you'll get it. And for us, it means very specific teachings around asking for earth life. That's why we have a distinction between Tzach B'Matsuin, which is up there, and Askil B'Matsu, which is down here. And so a lot of times when these elders are in ceremonies, they're asking for this one, not that one, because you might get it, and then they'll leave early, and then you might have regrets. So they say for us to be able to listen with your entire body, it would take some years of practice to give yourself back, and that the Creator would encourage you by brightening your aura and giving you more ability, because we're in a secular trading model. So your non-secular skills aren't going to be honed here in this process. They're only honed by people who know how to hone them, right? And some people already recognize that sensory deprivation chambers, for example, sort of play on that feature of our sensational abilities as humans. But we're the masters of it because we've been in the sweat lodge for eons. So you close your eyes, you make it dark, and you make it really hot so your sensations go all awry. The only thing left that you have left is the power of your mind. And that's what you focus on. And that's what gives you this new ability to listen beyond what you can hear. In other words, those sounds come. You can hear a song for miles. And they say that these people used to just use rattles, right? They didn't have torches, because they could see through the night. Because of that ability to be able to listen, to be able to see, to be able to smell on that level. Heightened awareness. And there's only a couple of examples in history where people recognize that there are more than 5 senses. And the one that I sort of question right away is when people say, well, how do you know you're alive? Can you touch your life? Can you smell it? Can you hear it? Can you see it? It might be one of those separate senses, you know. It might be what people think as a 6th sense, but it might even be more than that. And for example, Rudolf Steiner believed there was 12. That's just an example. It doesn't say anything about what elders are saying, because again, that's a protocol path meant for people who want to go down that path. It's not my obligation here to tell you anything beyond what that protocol says, because that's what's the key feature. You see, a protocol, it's worded in a certain way, and if it's happening on a spiritual level, and these spirits hear what you say, they can only respond to the words that are on that protocol. They don't respond to anything that goes beyond it. That's a new protocol. That's a new question. So hi for that. Kutak uyak.
Okay. I think at this point, I have to say, regretfully, we are running out of time. So what my task is to thank Dale, but also to thank the various people who made this event possible. So I have a bit of a list of people that I want to name, and I want to begin by thanking Deanne Lemay and Nicholas Ningafuk, who are the co-investigators for the SHIRK project that made this possible today. Melissa Daou, who's been our research assistant and who's coordinated back and forth between people and the speaker series. Christine Cusack at the Faculty of Education, who was key in terms of developing the communications. Elise Ferrarin Burgess of the Institute of Indigenous Studies and Research, who was also played a key role in helping to make this possible. I want to thank our 2 interpreters, Alain Breton and Sophie Hélène Simon, as well as our technician, Andrew, who showed throughout how to make things work and couldn't have made this possible. Most of all, I would like to thank Dale for sharing with us, for very generously sharing with us his profound, in many ways giving us a glimpse of the kind of profound knowledge and understandings and ways of seeing that you bring to these conversations, which is key in demonstrating that the whole processes of balance and of listening and of understanding. And also, I think, clearly shows the ways in which engaging in these kinds of conversations and also involves creating and understanding sort of respectful boundaries of where one can go and where one should not go in terms of even the questions that we're asking. And I hope this is just for us the beginning of a larger